All right. So again, this is a continuation from what we did last week. And so I'm just going to make sure to share it with you guys. Or I think you guys have all know where to find it on the GitHub repo. Does anyone ever know how to find that? I'll send it right now in case people don't. And so last time, I know Hazel, Bardo, you guys were here last time. So this will kind of be familiar going through. And I'll go ahead and just share I'm just going to go ahead and share my desktop, just make it easy. Sorry, there's the desktop. Okay, so this is the repo that we have been using. I'm going to put you guys over here. All right, and so what's it called? Last time we basically are going off of a website for the show called Adventure Time. Again, I really enjoy the show, so that's kind of like one of the reasons why I looked into it. But we talked about like one of the reasons why too. It's got some kind of, it's user inputted data. It's not super like, it's not necessarily easy. There's some Korean, for example, and one of the characters actually talk Korean and stuff like this. There are some mistakes going through. Some transcripts are actually missing for it. So it's kind of got an interesting part. It's a good kind of first take of say, like, you know, how do we approach this part. The reason why you might want to do this kind of scraping, for example, this is just more like for fun. Like you could do, for example, natural language processing. So you can do some NLP stuff with the material, saying like, you know, like, oh, like what kind of things do people say? Because they have sometimes some weird words that come about. This is kind of like more of a fun thing. Like you can maybe see a little bit of what that looks like for like any kind of show. One thing that you can do kind of expand this out is, for example, like if you're looking at reviews, basically like, hey, well, how do I go through reviews and making sure I pull this stuff information? So this is kind of like sometimes the way you can kind of look at other data that isn't accessible through an API and everything. So going through last time, I put the recording on here so that way you guys can see it later on. I know Hazel part over here, Giovanna, I don't know if you got a chance to look at what we got last time, but I'll kind of walk through it briefly because it's been a week. But it's over here on the actual repo. Last time we basically made a suit from the first episode. We just focused on one exact episode, this transcript specifically. We identified the speaker, extra narrative info or character. I think I looked it up and it was something called like action description of like things that the character does, but they don't actually say. That's in there. We removed extra white space, so there's not some, you know, funkiness in there, and we saved it into a data frame. So note that we didn't save this into some file format or database. We just kind of like said, oh, we're just putting in a data frame, and we call it a day right there. So again, this is the website we actually went on to. You can see here it's got a bunch of information, the name of the episode, some information about the episode itself, and then this is all user generated on the side here for sure. Is characters, and there's links to characters and stuff like that of what's going on. There's also like the transcript is complete, so this might be important as we kind of approach to see how do we do this more than just one episode, one web page essentially, right? And you can see here this is the actual transcript, so we actually found where the transcript occurs and we started searching for it. And you can see this is what I was talking about with like the different like, you know, scene descriptions and action direction. Here like the second line of the whole show, there's Korean speaking, so you can see here we have some Korean, and then it looks like a translation from here. So this is kind of something interesting to look out for. This is more like saying what the character is doing. So this is, you know, obviously extra information that's not being said. You can see there's more scene descriptions or action directions or action descriptions, whatever the technical term is. And you can just see the different characters here going through, and sometimes there's links to those different characters. And you can see there's even parts here. So there's a lot of information going through just this one part. And you can see this the whole episode. What's nice about this show, I didn't mention this last time, this show's episodes are like around 10 minutes long. So they're not super long episodes too. So it's relatively like easy to kind of scroll through. It's kind of a little bit of a kid's show. Like for example, like, you know, Starchy Farts. Like there's some kind of funniness in there too. It definitely gets a little interesting with how the show goes. And kind of like one thing, like if you ever watch the show, Adventure Time, you kind of see how it gets kind of a little dark in weird places and kind of deep sometimes, and maybe, you know, kind of a little trippy. So it would be interesting to see, you know, what the language kind of evolves over time. Okay, so that's kind of like the review of like what we've looked at before, some more Korean, right? And so let's see here. This is the actual script that we used last time. And so this again is on the GitHub itself, but basically we did some importing. In this case, we didn't actually do any plotting, I don't think, but you know, it doesn't hurt to actually have these imports in here. We also imported beautiful soup. You'll notice here is that I first put in the actual like list of transcripts, and what this website goes to, or this web page, this is the list of all the different transcripts on here. And so we only looked at one specific one right here. Today we're going to try to see if we can expand this out to, first of all, make it general so we can go on any web page on here and look at a different transcript, and then actually go iterate through this. You'll see at the very bottom too, there's definitely some missing ones. So for example, this one has no transcript found, versus like if I click on, you know, something that does have a transcript, you can see here it comes up, but you can also see transcript incomplete, and we can see there's no transcript here. So, oops, a little advertisement popped up. So, those are things to look out for. But if I click on like something that hopefully this one has a transcript, this one doesn't have a transcript either. So those are things we're gonna have to look out for as we get further and further. So this one's complete, and you can see here, it's kind of similar format. And note that because it's all user generated too, it's possible that this isn't going to hold, the format might change over time, or depending on who entered the different transcripts. So this is stuff that we'll have to consider going through. So yeah, okay, so it should be fun. But going back to that scraping one episode, that's what this is commented out, because I'm like, oh, instead of getting the main page, we're gonna go off of just one episode page. So that's what this test out one episode, and we'll clean this up a little bit. So we have our imports here, request, BS4, which is a beautiful soup. We have our transcript URL. So I like doing it this way because then it makes it very explicit, like, oh, I'm transcripting this URL specifically. And I'm going to that one. So this will be nice when we actually make it into the function where we can just pass in the URL, and you know, we can scrape any episode we want then. And then we can apply this more functional, more in a functional way. A response, basically, it's like literally just like getting the HTML stuff. We're using Beautiful Soup. So basically we're getting that response text. We're using an HTML parser. So basically Beautiful Soup does it for us. It figures out where all the parts are. We printed out the whole thing, which you can see, you know, prettify, you know, eyes of the beholder, I guess. Still kind of hard for us to read, right? So when we actually go through this soup, this is where comments really come in and say what happened. So this might not be the best way to navigate. So let's see what we were trying to do here. We're finding the H2 transcript, soup.find span ID equals transcript.parent. So what's happening here basically is we were looking for where this started. So if I do an inspect element here, we can hopefully see this is an H2. And we can see the ID is transcript. So this is for us to be able to find, oh, this is where it starts. And then we do a dot parent, like if you see right here. So this is right, this part right here, is soup.find, is going to find this element right here, which will be the span. But we don't want to be in that element. We want to be one above it so we can go further down. So we basically say, okay, get to the parent, which gets us to H2, okay? And then what we did basically is that for each of those parent, or from that parent, we just go into the next sibling. And we noticed that we did a not next sibling, next sibling. I believe this one gave us like a new line character. So this allowed us to kind of go into the next part. So that was going to here, which would return that DL. We can see here, that's our DL part. That's our first, what's it called? Our first, like our next sibling. And then we skip over to the next one, our next sibling, and going further, basically moving to the next line over and over and over again. I mentioned here, this might not be the best way to navigate. In general, in web scraping, if at all possible, you kind of want to avoid going through it structurally. And the reason why is that there might be differences in the structure and like how it's formatted depending on what web page you go. Usually the better way for us to do this is actually approach this in a way that we're using classes and IDs. Basically, something that says what this is, kind of like our anchor point, versus us going through the structure. I kind of imagine this as being more like, if you're going through the structure, you're kind of like feeling the walls and you're just kind of grabbing whatever's around you, versus like, you know, going in a direct place, kind of saying, oh, I'm going to put you here. I'm going to put you here. And so that's what we end up doing with this transcript line stop, find all DL. And so this is basically to replace all of this code right here. All right. And once we have our DL, which is coming from this part right here, all these different elements, these are all the different lines of the transcript, right? Once we have that, we can basically say, okay, cool, we found each line, and we're going to say if there were line and transcript lines, which is all of those DLs, we're just going to pull out that dd.text.strip. So what's happening here is that we get this element right here, and let's say I'm going to go to, you can see on the left side here where it says Finn, Jake, wake up, found a truck. And you can see right here, that's what this element is. We get this element, but we don't want just this whole element. We just want the stuff inside. So we get the .dd. So basically, it's a child of DL. And then we say within that DD, we say, okay, we want all that text in there. And you can see this text has got some extra markup, like a bold. You can see there's a hyperlink to the Wikipedia for Jake, that character, and then the actual parts of the line. So what we did here is essentially we got the line, which is DL. So we got this part right here. And then what we said, okay, let's do a .find DD. So we actually find this .dd right here, this, what's it called? This child element, okay? And then once we're inside that child element, we're gonna get just the text. So we don't want this extra, extra information. We just want the stuff within the DD. So that would be the text. And then we've got some extra kind of like junk kind of stuff that we kind of don't care about. Maybe in the future we might care about it. But right now we're like, yeah, we'll just get the text itself. And we do a .strip. So this strips out anything that's any extra characters, any extra, kind of like spacing and stuff like that for formatting. And just for testing purposes, I went ahead and print out the line string. So you can see here the very first line is actually like scene description. That's coming from right here. But this second line right here, Jake, yeah, you think you're, oh, am I in the right place? I think this is the right place. Yeah. So we should be, oh, this is a different episode, I think. Maybe not. Now I'm wondering if I got the right one here. Oh, I'm looking at the wrong episode, aren't I? So this is a Fix a Truck. This is a different episode. But the very first episode, the next line would be this right here. So we're getting just the text part in here. And we get the person who's saying it and then the whole text, including note that we also have this extra description, which maybe in the future we might want to get rid of that since they're not actually saying those things. So this is just going through the whole that whole transcript of that episode. I showed a different way you could do this too. You could basically write this in a list comprehension. So just know that there's other ways you can do these things. There's not one way to do this. And so I have this whole list of all the different lines in order. And so then after this point, I think I'm showing another way. I think that's why I copied here. So this is doing the same thing. Find that text.strip, test if it's extra space. So, okay, this is where I'm saying, well, I don't want the episode begins in the Canon Kingdom. I just want the actual saying. I made that decision. And so I'm saying, okay, we're going to save this as extra info. So that way we know this kind of, it's not a line, it's more like extra info that's being said. And so I'm saying that as oh, the person is going to be extra info that's saying this. Otherwise, what we're going to do, we're going to split, for example, this Jake part. We want to split the person by the colon. And then from that colon say, okay, go ahead and get the rest of what he's saying. And that's his line. So that's what this dot split here. And so we do that dot split, we should get the person equals split info 0, and then split info 1 dot strip, and then we basically save this part. So basically we have the person and whatever they say. And then we basically put this into, in this case I put it into a NumPy array. And you can see here that if I look at just all the different things, all the different characters, it goes extra info, Jake, Lady Rainicorn, extra info, Princess Bubblegum. So those are all the different characters in order of what they're saying. And you can see here, if I save this into a data frame, I just called it speaking and spoken. This is probably not the best way. We'll talk about how we can kind of fix this up and store this later. But the speaking is whoever's saying it. So if it's Finn, Jake, extra info, which is kind of our placeholder, almost like a narrator, and then what they actually spoke, what they said. And we actually get this information. And then we can basically say, hey, how much did people say? So you can see here the main character is Finn, 67 of the lines. Princess Bubblegum is about half of those lines. And then Jake. And you can see basically much everyone else are minor characters, barely saying anything at all. So this kind of gives a quick overview of what that looks like. So this is cool. It's all right, we got able to pull all this information out. But what we really want to do is we want to do it for all the episodes, right? And we also kind of want to keep this information, maybe later on, for example, in our cohort, we haven't talked about natural language processing. So maybe it's something we want to save for later. We don't want to have to rescrape the whole thing all over again, at least ideally, right? So we're going to see okay, let's make this kind of nice package so we can basically make it so there's this one function that's going to pull all the information. And then once we have all this information in there, we can store it into, for example, we'll use a SQLite database since that's something that we used before. Okay. Any questions in general, what we're kind of doing and what our goal is? Cool. All right. So hopefully that was a very hopefully a relatively quick review of like what we did last time. So otherwise, I would say go watch the recording for sure, right? So okay, so I'm going to close this guy because we're not going to use this guy right now. We're going to close this transcript. We're going to look at the very first day, and I'll go ahead and put this on the side of my screen. It's a little bit easier for us to navigate through. And let's see here. Let's go to the beginning here. So there's a few things that we're going to want to do. So right now we just did one episode, right? So, oh, this is not I care about. I was looking at the curriculum so we can talk about how to do it in database. We have just one episode. So let's go ahead and just make a new file in here. And so what my goal for this one is that we're going to design something that's going to pull in not just one episode transcript, but also like we can do it over and over again, okay? So we'll call this like pull all, or we'll say scrape all episodes. And let's give it a name so that way we have, it's not just untitled when we play around with it, okay? And so we'll kind of copy, what we're basically gonna do is gonna copy what this is going on here. So I'm gonna go ahead and copy this part. So remember that we're gonna use NumPy and pandas, right? And then we also are going to use our beautiful soup, right, with request, okay? And so this way we have our imports. I try to keep our imports up here because then it's nice and easy for us to kind of add in parts and see what the requirements are to run the script, okay? And I'm going to be really good and say, let's see here, function, call this function to scrape one episode, or I'll say given episode. Okay. So the idea here is I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to use this function. I'm going to build a function that's going to scrape this part, and then I'll go ahead and put down something right here, which is going to be our ultimate goal is scrape all episodes. So right now I'm kind of like thinking in my head, like, what is my goal? Like, what am I trying to do? Okay. And so there's actually a kind of a subtle part to this thing. It's like we saw how to scrape one episode, right? But we might actually, all we did right now, or the main thing we did is basically take each line and split it up, who's saying it and what was said, right? Which is a good start. So we're gonna go off of this. So I'm actually gonna go ahead, and this is where you might, for example, you kind of play around with something and then transfer it over into something more usable. I'm actually gonna take the parts and literally just copy it over, right? So one thing I'll do is I'll usually say, I'll make a function called like, get web page soup. So this is going to take in, for example, a URL, okay, and basically say, okay, it's going to produce some soups. And it's going to return, for example, it's like, okay, this will, I'll usually put like a little, what's it called? A doc string here to say like what this function is going to do. So this is me kind of planning things out and say, okay, like, and then I'm going to be really basic, right? I can go back to it and fix it up. At least I get the idea here. So I say like, given a web page URL, I'll call it a transcript, return the soup. Okay. So our soup is basically our beautiful soup part. So that's kind of what I'm implicitly saying here. And we can clean this up and go into more parameters of what's going on here. So I'm going to obviously return a soup here, right? So this is like after we scrape that one episode, or not what scrape it, we're basically just saying, give me all the stuff for it. And so we have that actually right here. And you can see here I have the transcript URL. That's the actual episode. And I'll go ahead and expand this so this is easier for us to see. This is the part that we really care about. So you can see here, this is the name of the episode. I have a response equals request.get the URL and actually make that soup from here. So I really want to copy this guy right here. And I put this into here. And you can see here, all I got to change now is just the URL. So now what is this function now? Whatever URL I basically put in, it'll get us our soup. And this might seem a little basic. Like it's like, oh, you don't really need to have this. And you're probably right. You don't necessarily need to have it. But this way it kind of stays consistent. And if I want to change things up, for example, something about this, like maybe I need to do something special about getting the URL. Another thing that we can maybe talk about in future times is if you want to do this in parallel, which means instead of having, you get one web page, bring it in, process it, get the next web page, bring it in, process it. You can have your computer basically get multiple pages as it's processing going through. And so this kind of makes it a little more modular and a little bit easier to find when there's mistakes that happen. Okay. So I'll go ahead and create this function. So now I have this get web page soup. And just to double check that it does in fact work, we'll go ahead and copy this guy. That's the first episode here. And this is not going to do anything too special. I'm going to do get web page soup. There's the name. Oops, gotta make sure I actually have. I'll call it like this. First episode web page. So that's the first episode web page, and I'll get first episode web page here, and then I'll just go ahead and do prettify. Is that right? Oh yeah. So since it's going to return soup, I can pretend this is my actual soup. So to make it more explicit, I could have done, for example, and I'll go do that now. I can do first episode soup. And that's all that is right here. And then I'm just going to make it pretty so I can read it just to make sure that I did get, in fact, the right episode. But now if I run this, it should just pull in that information. You see, oh, didn't work. I'm like, ah, well then run that code. So now I could go ahead and run this, and this should work now. Okay, and you can see here, here's our documentation. You can see it's kind of hard for us to read. So let's just kind of scroll down a little bit and see if I can find something that's relevant here. Oops. So for example, you see this is where it's like it's very difficult to like read through. But I can see here title Princess Bubblegum. I can see where someone say something. Div. Here's some interesting. So who's teleport? So I'm just going to see, all right, this actually worked. So who teleport? This should be the right page. I'm just going to find it in here. And I know it exists because there's 0, 1. Interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and do it. There it goes. Teleport back to Princess Bubblegum. So it looks like we got the right thing. So I'm just double checking that it actually pulled the right episode and everything. So we're good. So that was just a quick check. I can go ahead and get rid of this guy. So I don't really care about it. All right. So we got something that pulls the soup. It's really simple. Okay. And this is how you kind of like play around with something and then transfer it into something a little more manageable, a little more what we call it for production, where you can go back to it or other people can go back to it and check it out. Okay. So the next part is we're actually, okay, go ahead.
Good question, sorry. Wouldn't you be better including the prettify thing inside the function so you already get, could you do that, or is there a reason to do it like separately?
Yeah. The reason why I did this is really for testing. For the most part, I don't want to print it out every single time because it's like messy. And like, imagine if I'm getting every single episode and there's like, you know, let's say 250 episodes. I don't want to print out each time I pull an episode, the whole thing, because I'm never going to look at this basically. So this way I could add it into when I use this function, I could do like .prettify just to like confirm. But since I know that's not something like I'm going to necessarily use every single time, I'm going to exclude it. If it was something you want to use every time, it might make sense. I usually, when I talk about like using function names, get web page soup, this function name should make it really obvious what the function does, at least like what we pull in and what we put out. So in this case, I'm getting web page soup from a web page. I'm returning soup. I don't do anything else. So hopefully that makes sense. Cool. Good question though. And note kind of speaking of that, if you did want something like a debugging part, so like to see like if it does it, you might say like, you know, for example, show equals false. And I might do something like if show, I'll go ahead and do print, what is it, soup.prettify. And so what's nice about this is that this will only run, so if I run this now and I do that same web page, I deleted it before. So if I do this now, like this, there's no prettify in here, and I run this and you'll see that nothing happens. But if I put in, for example, true, or more explicitly, show equals true, then it'll do the same thing, but it'll actually do this part. So this is useful like debugging, and sometimes you'll see this kind of stuff in here just to make it easy for you to not have to go back and say, okay, now I want to print it out. So I'll keep it in there. It's not a bad thing to have. Okay, cool. All right, so next part now, we get our soup. I actually want to convert this stuff. Like we actually saw, okay, we got the soup. We actually want to do some stuff. And you can see here, I did this my first try. I'm not going to use this guy because it wasn't very good. I think I ended up using this right here. Okay, so I'm actually going to use this guy, and this is going to get all of the episodes and everything. But it's like, oh, that's right. We didn't just get all the episodes in here. We also, I'm sorry, get all the lines for the episode. we also went ahead and did the stripping and everything like this. And I think lower down, if I close this up, oops, let's go like here. So right here, I'm basically doing that same exact stuff. That's the beginning part. And then I'm doing some processing right here. So I do, if there's an extra info in here, making a person and stuff like this. So I'm actually going to copy this whole line here. And what I'm doing here now, I'm just going to define a new function. Let's go ahead and just run this so I can get rid of it. I don't like looking at this stuff. So we're going to say, okay, from this, we're going to take in a soup, right? So the web page soup, and we're going to create the data from it, right? So in this case, we might say, okay, like let's say get data from episode soup. Okay. And this is where like the function's kind of long and it's kind of clunky. I prefer them a little bit clunkier and longer because it's descriptive versus like just making something really, really short. Like if I just call it like define X, I don't know what X represents. So I'm just going to define it like this. I'll copy and paste my code into here, make sure it's indented correctly. So I'm going to kind of give a little quick description here. And so we'll say, given an episode's soup, return data on episode transcript. Okay. So that kind of gives us an idea of like what we're trying to do here, right? So the first thing we do right here is like, well, the first thing we did was actually find all the lines in the episode, right? And then what we did here is like, okay, lines with info. Okay, so we're basically going to build up, we're taking the lines with info and we're doing some extra stuff. So kind of remind us like, okay, for each line and transcript lines. So I'll just kind of say right here, like, go over each line in the transcript. And what should we call it? And clean it up. Okay. Also, we do a couple things too. So we'll say also save person in what is said. Okay. So this is kind of giving us a little quick like what's going on, so we can kind of look at this later, right? And then for each line, we see here. Oops. I find dd.text.strip. It might not be clear to me later on, like, why is this dd here? So I can say something, text is found and let's see here, dd element. So this way I'm like, okay, this way I understand, what's going on here. So this is why I'm doing this part right here. And then I say, okay, I have a commentary already. Test if it's extra info. Starts with a bracket here, and then we're going to save this as extra info. So hopefully that kind of makes a little more sense. I could maybe build more explicit on this, but that's all dependent on your comments and stuff, right? So what I'm doing here is say if the line at the beginning of the string, so the line string begins with this bracket here, that means we know it's not just someone talking, it's going to be some extra info. So I'm actually going to split this off, right? So it's like, okay, that means the person's going to be extra info. Otherwise, we're just going to split it by this colon right here. So we can see here, oops. Sorry, my mouse kind of went funky. We can see here, this is the person. And then what we want, we're basically going to have this whole line right here. So we actually want to just grab, we're going to split it off by this colon and split it by Princess Bubblegum and you've defeated the royal promise, couple, all that stuff, like the rest of the things they actually say. So we're going to split it. We get the person is the first part. The second part is the line string info, right? And we're doing a dot strip to make sure there's no extra white space and junk. And we can see here, we actually just went ahead lines with info, dot append, person, line, string. Okay, so this basically will go through that whole URL and do everything we do what we need for that. One thing you might notice, we forgot to put in a parameter here called soup. So this way we can pass the soup in here, and this will actually go through and do all this stuff. There is something I did notice, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with the split function. So we kind of talked about it last time, but it's good to kind of review it through. So I'm just going to literally copy this guy right here. And I'm going to say A is equal to this. I'm just testing things out. So let me just go ahead and put it like that. And if I do A dot split by a colon, we actually get to a list, right? Where the first element is the stuff to the left of the colon, and then the other stuff is by to the right of the colon. Note, however, if I put in another colon here, well, let me ask you guys, what do we want if there was another colon right here? Because right now we're getting the person and then the script. Bardo, it looks like he.
Yeah, I mean, you could get like 3 different, right?
Right, so we might get 3 different things, but we'd want to have this whole thing by itself, right? We want just that part. So let's just test it out just to see if it works, right? And you can see here, ooh, right, we got not that stuff. We're like, that's not good. So one thing we can do, we can start like, okay, like, well, we can combine these parts and stuff like that, but usually the better thing to do is say, well, how does split work? And so I'm just doing a shift tab here, and we can see here there's a split, the separator, which is the first parameter, so that's the separator. And then we have this other parameter that we didn't know. It's max split minus 1, list of strings. Return a list of strings using the separator as, and we can go in the further part. But this max split is probably what's going on here, is that it looks like the default is -1, which usually means when it's an integer like this. Let me ask you guys, when you read this max split -1, first of all, max split probably means how many times they can split. What does that -1 probably mean in this context? Anyone got a guess?
It might be like the character right before the column until that.
Maybe the character right before. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so it would cut, and at that point, that could be the.
Okay, that could be it. So it might be a little ambiguous. So let's check this out, right? So one thing I can just go right here. I can expand it out in Jupyter Notebook. And so return a list of the words S using the separator as a delimiter string. If max split is given, so if we define it, at most max split splits are done. So okay, so this seems to say max split is saying how many times will it split at most. And so it looks like if we give it a number, so something that's not -1, it'll actually consider how many max splits. Otherwise, it'll just keep splitting. And it says if separator is not specified or is none, any white space is the part. So okay, so I think with this -1 here, and this is usually more for programming convention, as you guys see this more and more, sometimes you'll see a -1 basically mean like, oh, don't consider the max split. Basically, there is no maximum. Just keep going forever. But that -1 is a good idea what it might do, because that's how lists work. So that's pretty good. But this is more for a computer science convention that you'll see this a lot. So what we do want here is we actually want to change this parameter then, right? So we actually can do max split. And how many splits will we want?
1.
So let's see, 1 and 2. So let's try it with 2. Let's just see if 2 works, right? So max split here, we only want to split it where it comes up with this right here. So we run this, and that's not quite right, right? So what we can try is like what Bardo said, 1 split, and we can see it splits just 1 time. Okay, so that's what we want, right? Just for the fun of it, let's try doing 0. Let's see what it does. Okay, that kind of makes sense. It doesn't split at all, right? There's no splits. And that's why if you put like -1 specifically, usually that means do the maximum number of splits. Just keep going, okay? So we actually want this to equal 1. So there's a little bug that I kind of caught right before we finish this up. So I'm going to go ahead and change the split so it splits across just 1 time. So we only have that first colon, and we just split it right there, okay? So, and this is honestly, like, there could be an issue, like, for example, if there's Princess Bubblegum is her name, then we might have some more issues in this. But for the most part, like, well, hopefully we don't come across it. If we do, we'd have to figure out some new thing to figure out how do we consider this kind of thing. For example, you might have to consider it from the right side versus from the left side. So those are things that you're going to have to consider when you get into those points or those weird cases. But we're going to go those since we don't see that right now. And I don't think it makes sense that there's going to be a character like this name. Okay, but it could. All right, so I'll go ahead and delete this guy. And going back to here, looks like it's all good here. And I'm just going to return. This is not going to be the full thing, but we'll just go ahead and lines with info just to double check that it works. So if we run this now, we have our function. We'll go ahead and test it out. So in this case, we're actually going to do our episode soup. It's going to equal to get web page soup. Okay, And so this will be from this URL, and I need the actual URL of this guy. So I don't know if I can look at that. So I'm going to go to episode URL, episode, oops, and we'll put this here. Okay, so then we have the episode URL, we have the episode soup, and then we want to set episode data, right? And this is going to equal to our get data from episode soup. We'll call it episode soup. So good. So this is like a nice kind of neat thing. Hopefully this kind of makes sense for us. We have the URL, we get the web page soup from this URL called episode soup. And then we have ep data, which is get data from episode soup from ep soup, right? So okay, that seems to make sense. So we'll go ahead and run this guy, and you can see it didn't take too long, only less than half a second. So we'll see this data, and so hopefully we can see here it's going to be a list, right, of information. So we can see, okay, it looks like it's going pretty well. So what we want to do is, like, for example, we'll do 0. Let's do the first one, right, and just see if this kind of comes out. So this should be the very first line, which should be extra info, if I remember this right. Okay, here it is, extra info, and we should just have that whole thing right there, and we should see, and you can see, yep, looks good. Let's try it with 1. So this is going to be Jake is saying, yeah, you think. So we'll see if that runs, and cool, looks good, right? Okay, so cool, like that means we're getting all the lines in here. So now, like, we got all the lines, awesome. Okay, so what's our next step after this? Like, what might we want to do? Well, what next thing we did was actually make this into a NumPy array and then save into a data frame, which could be useful, but in this case, I might want to actually save this information later on too, right? So a couple things when you think about this stuff is what kind of information you're actually going to pull from it. And so let me ask you guys, like, looking at this, like we're looking at the transcript and stuff like that, and we can see like there's some extra info and stuff. Is there anything that we should be saving that we aren't saving? Or we should make it more explicit that we're saving this stuff?
Whatever is between the square brackets,
okay,
at the end, or
Yeah.
like
yeah, this is where, like, you're talking about, like, with someone's line, right? We have someone's line and we have these square brackets in here, right? That's what you're saying, Bardo? Yeah, and so this one's like, like, you know, like, this might make more sense where we don't want to include this in what he's saying, right? Because he's not saying these words. So if you imagine if we did something with natural language processing and we only want to see what Jake actually says, the problem is if we have this whole thing in here, it's going to think that he's saying, you know, ladies level, and maybe, you know, this level comes out a lot of times in what he's doing, not what he's saying, and it makes it look like he's saying level constantly over and over and over again, and that's not what he's actually doing. So we actually might want to remove this, or what might be also relevant is maybe save this as extra information. So this is kind of like where you kind of go through your process of not just like how to web scrape, but saying, what do I do with the information once I have it? So right now we only had, you know, who is speaking and what's spoken, okay? And so we'll name these parts differently. So kind of looking a little bit of ahead, and I'm gonna go ahead and get rid of this guy. And this is just me testing, so I'm gonna go ahead and just put testing here so I remember that if I come back to it, it's not gonna like mess me up. So if I do testing here, what I wanna do, right, is I wanna say, okay, I want to save who is talking. I wanna save what is said, right? And then this other part here, like, let me ask you guys, what do you think we should do with this extra info? Like, if I wanted to save this information, and right now we're just basically doing each line where it's what the person's, who the person who said it, what is said, what should we do with that extra information with the square brackets, like in this situation?
We could save it as well.
Say that one more time, Hazel?
You could save it as well.
You could save it as well, right? And so maybe that's something like we have like who's talking, what's spoken, and maybe what would we call that last part if we wanted to save that?
context or
maybe save context, action, right? Description, okay? It all depends exactly what we want to call this. I'm going to call it, context might be a good one, but I'm actually going to make it a little different. I'm going to say action. So this way I know it's like, okay, it's something they're doing, or let's call it action description, since I think that's the technical term. I just looked it up on Google like real quickly before we started. So I'm going to call it action description. So, and I think that makes sense, right? He stretches to be on lady's level. You know, you can see here, let's see someone else who does it. I'm seeing if some, okay, here, applies the serum. So these are things that they're doing, you know, for example, oh, here's an interesting one. We have giggles as well. So you can see here, it's like, okay, not only do we have, you know, what, you know, it doesn't happen just once, it could happen multiple times. So this is where like, okay, we might have to look for these square brackets and actually consider when this happens multiple times. So we might say like save action descriptions, right? And so this is where it's important to kind of like think about like what your database is going to look like and how this is going to work. And so this is where I'm going to first kind of go off like a little bit of probably the way you likely would do this. In reality, you would have something different. So I'm going to show you what this might look like. So if I had like a table, right, I might have like my data frame. I'd have my first part is, I'll make it like this part. So if I have, for example, my first column is, you know, let's say person speaking, right? And my next thing is going to be something like line, right? Line said or line spoken. And the next part might be, you know, like action descriptions. Okay. And so what this one might look like, and I'm just making the markdown tables to make it nice and easy for us to read it later. So I have a line spoken, who is speaking it, and then our action descriptions. And so what this would look like is, let's say for this example right here, we'd have something like Princess Bubblegum. So I'll just put, I'll call her Princess just because it's easier for me to write. So I have Princess, I have the line spoken, and this line spoken is going to be we used to date. And then after that, I'm going to have the action or the different actions. So for example, I might actually keep this as like, for example, a list of actions. So for example, I'd do like, let's say, it's going to mess me up. So let's say giggles. Oops, sorry. I'm trying to make sure it doesn't mark down, so it's going to look pretty. I said giggles, and then the next one's going to be something like, I'm just kind of putting this together real quickly. The next one is going to be applies the serum. Okay, and so you can see here, this is what it looked like in our data frame, right? Is person speaking, line spoken, action descriptions, princess, we used to date, giggles, and the original, I'll just put this right here. So let's say original. Again, this is kind of like, I'm just doing this stuff mostly for you guys to kind of visualize what's going on versus me just saying it out loud. So this is like what they say. Oops. Oh, it's because it's trying to detect this guy. Sorry, this is because it's marked down. Again, you normally wouldn't do this yourself. I think this is kind of me just documenting it for you guys so you can see it. No, is that right? Person speaking. Oh. There we go. So we can see here, here's the original, what they said, here's the person speaking, we used to date, and then the action descriptions itself. So we kind of want something like we get this line, we want the who's saying it, we want to say what was actually said, and then any action descriptions, we might want to catch all those parts that are actually being, you know, described. Okay? Does that make sense? Sound good? So I think we can still keep this part. So we just need to figure out who's being said. So I might, for example, just call this, you know, defining who is saying what. Okay, and then my next part right here, it might be something like, okay, we want to say, let's see here. So this is going to be this line strip right here. So this line string. we can see basically that should be everything that's not the person, right? So now we want to say, okay, get what is said. And then we might do something like get any action descriptions. Okay, so this is kind of how we might split it up. So we can see here, this is pretty much done, right? We're just adding some new extra information. So it used to be line string would be exactly what they said, right? And that would be done with it. But now we have this new part, like get any action descriptions. So this is where, for example, this might be useful to kind of like make another function on top of this to kind of make it nice and easy. So we're actually gonna put it, so let's see here if I make this small. We're gonna go ahead and make a new cell right here. So we'll define it here. So we'll say get line said and action descriptions. Okay. And so I'm making a function right here, and I'll put like line string. So what's going to happen here is that we're going to get a line string. Get a line string. Then return, let's say a tuple, right? So it's basically this thing and that. So get a tuple of what was said and a list of line actions. Okay, or what's that? Action descriptions. A list of action descriptions. Okay. So hopefully that kind of gives an idea of what's going to happen, right? So for example, we'd have something like return. It's going to be line said, and then it's going to be action descriptions. Okay. This is what we want, and we need to figure out how to get this part. Okay. So first thing we do is we take that line string, right? How would we apply, what would we do to get, like, if we're getting then just this string right here? So let's say this is line string. And let's go ahead and put this in here. We have our string right here, say who's talking, we already got that. So we have this line string, right? And I'll just go ahead and print this down right here. You can see here, that's what's right here. But we want to find just this part. We want to get rid of these action descriptions. So anyone got any ideas of how we can do this? And throw out any idea.
Regex.
Regex, right? That's one way we can do it. So regex, again, basically can find special patterns and stuff like this. This can be super useful. So this is something we can kind of talk about some things. Is there any other ways we could maybe do this? I'm just trying to make it essentially like as simple as possible from what we already know.
Just by checking the brackets?
So checking the brackets. So how would we do that?
Loop, some kind of loop, for loop or a while loop or something like that.
Yeah. So we can loop through, for example, find those parts, maybe beginning. We might be able to try to figure out something with split and stuff like this. And so I'm just trying to throw out a bunch of options out right now. And to be quite honest, the best option is really regex. Like that's going to be the one that's going to do us the best thing. So we'll go ahead and try to do regex from here. So I realize how much time we have, so I don't want to take us too long. But let's see here. Let's say we're going to go back up to here. We're going to say line said. We'll just, by default, we'll say that's the line string. And then we'll say these are defaults. So I'll say defaults. So in case we don't have anything that works, right? We can at least have the defaults. And then action descriptions. We'll just start this off with an empty list. So maybe there's no action descriptions, right? So at least then, if this works right here, we can at least have something that works, right? So for example, now we can put this in here. We can actually put this, get any action descriptions, and I'll say in what is said. And so for example, I'll go like this. I'll call it line string here. And this is going to give us a tuple, right? So this is kind of a fun Python thing we can do. We can say, let's see, we'll call it, instead of line string, we'll call it, line said, comma, I'll call it just action descriptors. Okay, and so that it's a little messy, but that's okay, right? So we have line said, action descriptions, and this way we can say, okay, lines append. What we'd want is, for example, instead of just line string, we now have line said, action descriptions. I should just call action descriptions since that's what we're doing. Okay, and so we have those two parts in here. And now what happens when it runs through, once we finish up this function, at least now it works, right? It'll do something, right? It'll go through this part and we'll have 3 different parts just to make sure this works fine. And the reason why I'm doing this partly is one for testing, but also, and we'll check out, for example, let's try the 5th one. Or let's try the 12th one. You can see Mr. Cream Puff. Let's do the next one because that's going to be the one that's going to be all funky. So we want this one to work, right? So right now, I basically, by default, I'm just getting the person and then getting the whole line as the line said. And then the action descriptions by default is just be empty. We're going to eventually actually change this and say, okay, get the action descriptions with regex. Okay. So do you guys want me to show that part then? I know we're a little close on time. Any thoughts? Thumbs up if you want me to keep going. Save it for next time.
I would want to see how you use the regex to extract that information. If that time works for you.
Okay. How's it sound? Thumbs up, thumbs down, Hazel. I'll kind of use a little quick thing. Okay. So let's do this real quick. So let's try, we're going to go import a new part. So I'm going to put it up here. Just here. Import RE, right? And so remember, if I have this part right here, and we're going to go through some quick stuff. And this is where I will give you guys a little notice is that I am not perfect at this stuff. So we're going to do our best we can. So I'm going to look this up a little bit too. But let's say, for example, we have, let's see here. Let's double check this. Okay, regex Python. So what's nice is that we have the beautiful Google for us to search all these things. I'm looking up this specific library, and I'm just looking to see exactly what we can do. And I want a file that is, or not a file, an example. So they're doing a search, for example. They're searching for these different parts, and they're doing a group. And so basically, this is the regex itself. This is the actual string we're passing in. So for example, I'm going to go and take this line string right here. We'll go ahead and keep this right here. I'm going to use it. I know there's a compile, which this is what I really want. Okay, here it is. So we want a pattern right here, and then we'll actually do a match. So I want to compile where we start off with a, what's it called? A back, or not backslash, square bracket. So I'll just do regex. I know there's one that I like, this one right here. So this is nice because I can basically replace whatever I want in here. For example, I can go ahead and take this string right here, and I can test it out within here and make it nice and easy. So what I want to find are the string itself. So I know because regex has special formatting, I want this part in here. And in this case, oops, let's go ahead and try something out just to see. So you can see here, this is how it specifies a group. So I want this stuff in here. So I actually want this group, and it's going to, let's see here. I want to get the bracket that's on here. I want any characters that are in there. So this is any character, repeat as many times as you want, and then it's going to end with a back bracket right here. Okay, and I want this group. So you can see here, that doesn't quite work out. So you can see here, it's getting everything. And let's say I just end it with S. So let's see here. Let's see. So let's start off with this guy since this is easy to see. Okay, so you can see here, this is what we want. This is basically what we want, but we wanted to start off with a back bracket. Okay, and then this should be where we just should have a final bracket, and I'm not sure. Oh, that's the white space, that's why. Oh, this needs to repeat as many times as we want. So actually, I want to go ahead and only collect this stuff. What's going on? Sorry, guys. This is where you get to see me suffer with regex as much as possible. So, okay. I want to grab all of this. I want to do, that's a white space. I want this to repeat. So I might have to hold this.
Only uppercase characters, like with the AC.
Oh.
Or, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I thought. See, this is where, to be quite honest, every year I tell myself I should learn some regex. So let's just type in the really simple one. Let's type in giggles and see if that's giving what we want. And you can see it's not really giving what we want. This will give us what we want. Okay, so we can see, okay, that's what we have. We have to replace this now with some character. So let's say, for example, okay, let's start with any character any number of times. But of course, because it's getting all this very end here, we have to say this, okay, we need something to specify when this ends here. This is where it gets a little tricky. I'm saying, okay, we need to find this different grouping. So let's see here. I think we might have something like this. This is where, like, again, where it all depends on how you do your regex. So this should only apply within here itself. Let's see here. I'm trying to think what our best thing to do. Yeah, because this will work like this. I'm not sure why it's collecting this part right here, because this should be the actual group. Okay, okay, it does catch this part. I'm just doing the notation. So we'll capture all of that part right here. But since this can repeat, it can then be 0 times, and then say, see, this is where you have to say like exactly what part. I realize I'm kind of low on time here, and I do have to go. So maybe this is something I'll keep for next time, if you guys are okay with that. And this is where I will be the first one to admit that my regex is not strong. But you'd want something basically to say, okay, we're going to capture this group. We need basically, it can start off with, it needs to be within this square bracket. And then what we need to have next is say, well, okay, we need to catch all of those groups that happen like this. So I believe I can go. Yeah, I'm not. Oh, I know. Okay. So that will capture all of those parts that are matched within here. Note that it's including white space as well. So that's part of the reason why you see this extend outward right here. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm wrong. Like this. And so this should capture just giggles in there. So you can see here that captures, but it's only capturing the first one. I have to have this whole thing repeat multiple times. And this is where it gets kind of complicated, saying, okay, like we need to make sure we not just capture, what's it called? We don't just capture the first one, but anytime it's anywhere. And that's where we'll have to kind of play around with. This is where, you know, if your regex is strong, it'd be good. My regex is not strong, so this takes me a little bit more time to go through. But that's what we would apply here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Is regex another Python library, or is just it's JavaScript thing?
Yeah. So RE is the regex library. Regex itself is more like pattern matching. So it's, I don't even know what to call it. It's not even like a programming language. It's much more like a notation of saying what patterns they are. So you'll find regex not just in Python, but also JavaScript, Java, like almost every language has some form of regex. Even like text editors, you use a program, will have a way to specify regex where you can say, oh, go ahead and find, these matching patterns. And that's where to be quite honest, regex, if you understand it, it's very, very good and very, very useful. If you're not as good at it, it looks like a bunch of characters going on right here. But you can see here JavaScript browser is just something this thing's using specifically. Does that make sense? So maybe this is something we can talk about for next time. So we kind of did it with only 5 minutes left. I know time's gonna go over, but I can do, so one thing this is actually a good thing. We can actually put, for example, things that we need to do and say to do, I'll put things, for example, to do, and this is pretty common in programming. We'll start a comment and we'll say to do, and we'll say find action descriptions with regex. Okay, and so find action descriptions with regex. Okay, so this should hopefully say, okay, in the future, if we need to go back to it, we can just search for a to do and we can go from there. So kind of cleaning up, just making sure things look good. I'll just call this testing. Test 1 episode. I would say user, action descriptions. So this way I know what I'm gonna come back to, okay? But you can see here, what's nice is that even though I didn't finish this one function, instead of being stuck and think, oh, I can't do anything until I finish this one function, I can in fact go further and actually say, okay, well, that function, it technically isn't done, but it does work. And so I can keep using it. And at least that way I can do something with the information I have going on. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So this is in reality of you're gonna have sometimes to have limited time where you have to head out and everything like that, or if you're working, it's the end of the workday and you're in the middle of something, you don't want to just oh well, I need to finish this, otherwise I won't remember what's going on. This is where you can use comments and everything like that. So I'll say example of what you want to achieve. All right, does that make sense to everyone? Kind of why I put it this way? All right, cool. And so, yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm. All right, so I'll go ahead and stop it here, and then we'll try maybe doing this again next week. We'll maybe go over regex a little bit more and say, okay, let's go over regex. I'll probably do, to be honest, I'll probably do a little research to make sure that this will work the first time. This is if you're not as familiar, it's a lot of playing around with and understanding what's going on. And maybe we can walk through that next time. Cool.
Okay, thanks.
All right, no problem. Okay, so I'll go ahead and stop recording. I'll make sure to share my